Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna B. Miss Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. So for today's video, we're going to be continuing on with a few of my favorite things. In previous episodes, you'll know if you've watched, we featured a drum that we have that was played at the Battle of Gettysburg and a footlocker from World War I from a soldier who died in Belfast, Ireland. If you haven't checked out those episodes, make sure to check them out after this. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about a photo album that we have from the Spanish-American War. Now, we are lucky enough in our collection to actually have two different photo albums from that war. One was from the Company A, 1st Nebraska, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit next week. But this week, we're going to be talking about the 51st Iowa Volunteer Infantry Regiment and the photo album that was donated by one of their soldiers. So, if you know anything about the Spanish-American War, you know that it was fought in 1898. April 25th is when the U.S. declared war on Spain. And this war was actually the first war that was fought overseas for us. So McKinley asked for 125,000 volunteers, but when that wasn't enough, Congress actually authorized the use of National Guards. And each state was in charge of sending its own troops. So Iowa at the time had 4 different divisions in this National Guard, and they were just labeled as 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, because as a National Guard you couldn't go fight overseas, it became something entirely different, and they had to therefore be relabeled. So how did they become the 51st Iowa Volunteer Regiment? Basically, in the Civil War, there were 48 regiments for Iowa, and because this became something entirely different, they were relabeled as divisions 49, 50, 51, and 52. And these, particularly today, like I said, we're talking about the 51st Iowa Volunteer Infantry Regiment. And of those 4 regiments, the 51st is the one that served the longest time in the Philippines. So originally, they started training at what they called Fort McKinley, which was literally just the Iowa State Fair in Des Moines. And after that, they got sent to Camp Merritt, and then on to Camp Miriam at the Presidio, which is a military base in San Francisco. At this time, it was not all happy, happy, joy, joy. More than 90% of the U.S. casualties from this war were from disease. And in the 51st Division, before they even left for the Philippines, 27 men had died from disease. So in October is when they received orders to go and sail for the Philippines, and they set off in early November. Now, at this time, fighting had actually ceased in the Philippines because we won the war in mid-August, but U.S. troops had to be stationed there until the peace treaty was signed. So these guys boarded the U.S. Transport Pennsylvania, which was a converted freighter, and that lets you know about everything you need to know. Super cramped quarters, because it's converted, it's not what it's meant to be used for. Super cramped quarters, inadequate ventilation, few amenities. On the way over, they did stop in Honolulu, and I do have a lot of photos of their times in Honolulu, but then it was back on the ship where they arrived December 7th in the Philippines, and they were forced to stay on board awaiting orders. They actually stayed on board for quite some time before they were assigned to rotate between frontline duty, which meant in the trenches, and guard duty at the fort. They stayed there rotating between those positions until they were relieved by the 22nd U.S. Infantry on September 4th, 1899. Now, at this time, 53% of that regiment was on the sick list. So you would be thinking, I'm going home. I'm getting on the first ship to go home. Surprisingly, several men from this division stayed behind because they wanted to serve in this newly formed regiment, or they wanted to pursue their own entrepreneurial ventures in the Philippines. But those that wanted to go home gladly grabbed the U.S. Senator and took that back home. They arrived back on October 22nd. They discharged and were mustered out on November 2nd, and they headed back to Iowa, where there were plenty of parades and parties for their arrival. In the end, this group, the 51st Iowa, lost 2 men killed in combat. They had 38 wounded, and they lost 41 to death of disease or other causes. All in all, this effort took about 18 months. So now I'm going to show you some really cool photos from our Spanish-American War photo album, donated by Harry Watson Price, a member of the 51st Iowa. Watson Price was born in Chicago in the 1870s. He moved to Iowa and served in the National Guard. After the war, he moved to York, Nebraska, and he married Belle Pruitt Warner in 1902. he settled down here and became a jeweler. So let's take a look at some of these photos. Okay, so here are both of our Spanish-American War photo albums. This one specifically covers the 51st Iowa Infantry, and as you can see, it was donated by Harry Watson Price. So this first page, you've got House Cleaning Day for Company A. There's Inspection Company A. Here's them with the 51st Iowa colors, and them in a dress parade. Later on in the album, you're going to see them hanging out in Camp Merriam. Here's the barber shop. Here's them hanging out with their bosses, first lieutenant and captain. Here's John B. Findley, bugler, Company A. They did do some touring of California where they were there. I really enjoyed this picture here. Lots of palm trees. And then back at Camp Merriam, Corporal Ed Cornell and Private Harry Price, the donator of this album. Here's Fatigue Duty. Here's Lieutenant Killhorn again. Here's House Cleaning Day. After all that training is when they leave for military service. So here we are off to Manila. Here we got guard detail. Here is camp of the 51st at the Presidio, taken by Miss Mary Conway. I mentioned a stopover in Honolulu. Here are some of the sights that they saw. There's them coaling the Pennsylvania there in town. And now we start our photo series on the U.S. Transport Pennsylvania. So here's the ship itself. Here is them celebrating Thanksgiving in the middle of the Pacific. Here is the foretop when they were leaving Honolulu. That's a really neat one. Here's more sights from the ship of them leaving San Francisco. This one says second day out. This one says at mess. This is their captain, Doxrude, Steward Blackstock. The dining room. Remember how I talked about how crowded it was? There's a pretty good example of that. That is what you're living with every single day. Super, super, super crowded. Barely any room to sit or breathe. Here's a great picture that doesn't look dangerous at all. And on that note, there's another. Here we have photos of other transport ships. Indiana, Baltimore, Philadelphia. Here are two on the Olympia, which is actually the U.S. flagship at the time that Admiral Dewey sailed on. Here is Christmas dinner from 1898 on the U.S. Pennsylvania. It looks like Spusley, Price, Burt, Price, Snore, Toulouse, George, McCarthy, Scholes, Ness, and Lingley, possibly? It also covers the Spanish wrecks back when our ships completely decimated the entire Spanish fleet in less than 6 hours. Here's an English steamer. This is the Reina Cristina. That is the flagship for Spain at the time. And actually, I'm going to walk you over here because this is really cool. We have a copper spike in our display that came off of that flagship. Just another one of the many things you'll see here in our Spanish-American War section. There are also several pictures of their time in the actual Philippines itself. And that's just a few of the photos in this album. Now, I was lucky enough to be able to take this to Eagle Printing in Lincoln, Nebraska, where they were able to enlarge several of the photos for me. So here are some of those enlarged photos and how they turned out. So you saw the picture earlier. 51st Iowa colors. Here's the inspection. And then I'm going to jump to my favorite. So check out this page here with the captain and Blackstock and how well that coloring turned out. Just really neat. And then we took several of their photos and we actually turned them into canvas as well. a big, huge thanks to Taylor at Eagle Printing, who took just a ton of time out of her schedule to put this together for us. So that's just a few of the photos from this Spanish-American War album. If you want to see more, come and see us. And like I said, stay tuned this week. I'm going to be posting more photos and more information about the men that are in those photos. Have a great week.